even a very small change in this could like change the world, right? I mean, like if you could, there's somebody that says, like, there's somebody that was talking about something like if you could increase the intelligence of people by like 1% or something, like just the enormous change that would have. Like, I think if you could increase the attentional capabilities of people and help make their lives even go like 1% better on an aggregate level, the amount of difference that would make would be staggering. It'd be enormous.
Welcome to Digital Mindfulness. I'm your host, Lawrence Sampofo. Today we're here for the second part of the interview with James Williams of the Oxford Internet Institute. In this part of the show, we focus more on the time well spent movement, the dangers of clickbait, and how we can design to enhance our intention and live better digitized lives. So let's go right into the show with James Williams. So one of the things we were speaking about previously was this idea of the structure of these digital services that we use every day. And you were saying that even if we were to use ad blockers in many cases, that it wouldn't actually matter because the structure of lots of different services they're structured like adverts. And I'm wondering if you can just go into that a little bit more for the audience.
So I don't know if search engines would fall as much into this category because, like I said, they're kind of more intention based than attention based. But like, let's take like a social network. So one way I think about this is, if you think about the goals that you have for your life and the things that you want to do, whether that's your goals today, this week, this month, and then you think about the goals that the system is designed toward. There are probably no situations, if any, where those goals align. So my goal would be something like finish my doctoral research, learn to play the piano better, et cetera. But the goals that are actually like on the dash, not what they say in their marketing messages, what they put on their dashboards in the product design meetings are things like, get users to spend more time on the site, to click on these things more, look at more things in the news feed, whatever. And so I think that's like a very stark kind of illustration of the root of some of these issues. And so the way that then, if the design is all angled toward these goals of getting you to spend more time, spend more attention, to engage with more pieces of content, what it's going to do then is going to be designed in a way that that maximizes those goals or seeks to maximize them. And so, but then that design is not limited to the individual ads themselves. So like, let's say you take away the ads, all of the content, all of the other design mechanisms that were still serving those goals are still going to be there. So it's not that it's like a neutral medium and then there are ads and as a kind of separate thing. Like the whole thing is the ad, right? It's like, one way I've talked about it is like, it's like a flypaper and a swatter. It's like if the ads are kind of the swatter, you avoid the swatter, but you're still stuck on the flypaper. So the whole system is designed to, like with the character of the ad, and toward the goals of the ad. So, and you don't avoid that just because you kind of got rid of the ads themselves, because it's all an ad in that sense.
So then, James, what would you say then that an intentional or mindful social network, what would that look like? It's a billion-dollar question.
Right. Well, I think that. So I think in the terms of the goals, if we were to kind of start there, like I think it would be one where it seeks to understand me as a user and what I want to do with it and what my goals are. So why am I giving it my time in the first place? And so I think that would be the fundamental starting point is kind of trying to really understand me, understand my goals and align its goals and its design with mine. So I think there would be more of a conversation about what my goals are. There would be more kind of that back and forth of about, is the system actually helping me accomplish my goals? And then it would be, in what way, with what frequency, in what context do I want to engage with the system? Because a lot of these systems now, they're trying to sort of just be present in every context of our lives, as much of our lives as they can, and I think that that's unfortunate, because it then means that our attentional world becomes this kind of endless flow of like these potential informational rewards. It's kind of like the character of a slot machine. And I think then there was a great Onion article a little while back that said 3 hours using Facebook before bed referred to as winding down. And I think we've all had this experience where you just lose so much time in the kind of compulsive use of something like this. So I think I think the system would let us set boundaries on it, basically, and say, here are the times of day that I want to use this system. Here are, here's the total amount of time in a given day I want to use the system. Basically letting us define the when and the where and the why of our use of it, rather than it just kind of being defined by the system and implicit in the background, and really not even being understood well, if at all, by users.
So moving to this phenomenon of fake news and talking about intentionality in design, what do you think then in an intentional news network or social network, do you think that fake news or fake content would be a problem? Do you think it would even arise?
I mean, I think fake news has always existed in some sense. And I think there is a kind of definitional question of what counts as fake and who gets to say it and all that. But I think that you're exactly right that the point about fake news is not that it's fake, in my view, and that it's false. Like that is not the sort of the nature of the problem. The nature of the problem is that is in the effect that it produces, right? And so the reason that it's there is because it gets more people to click on it, because like to me, whether it could be true news or it could be fake news, but whatever is going to get more impressions and more clicks is going to get put there. And the fact that it happens to be something that's not actually true, to me, is sort of beside the point, because like you're saying, it's a question of the incentives of the system and what they're designed to promote. And it's the medium and not the message that is really the thing that is causing the trouble. And so I think it's unfortunate to see the direction that the debate about fake news has gone in the wake of the U.S. election, because it's an example of people focusing on the content of the medium rather than the design of the medium. And thinking that that's the actual problem. It's sort of the information-centric view of it rather than the attention-centric view of it. So, and I think, then all these various things that have been proposed of, well, if we get Facebook to come up with some way of filtering fake news out or determining what's real and what's fake. I mean, I think it's exactly the same problem that you saw in the EU with the right to be forgotten ruling, where people want to have information removed from search results about when you type in their name because it reflects poorly on them. But in the end, the way that they have said to operationalize it is to then have search engines, to have Google be the one to determine what is or is not in the public interest. They put that responsibility onto the company. And to me, that's a fascinating thing that people are just so open to doing that, because to put that responsibility in the hands of a private company. And I think it's kind of what people are saying Facebook ought to be doing here is they should be the ones to determine what's true or false. Like sometimes I wonder if people are listening to themselves when they're saying this. But the fundamental problem is that by thinking about this in an information-centric rather than attention-centric way, they're focusing on the content. The content as the problem, as opposed to the kind of interaction dynamics that the content exists to produce. And if they were to change those incentives, then I think you may have like kind of fake news in the sense that there might be some things that are false. But I mean, I know for a fact that some of my friends on Facebook post things that are false all the time. Like I think that's just part of human life. I don't think that, but I don't think it wouldn't be sort of surface to my attention in the same way to kind of induce me to give it attention, to click on it, to produce some effect. Like the internet is kind of becoming an outrage machine because of this. Like every week we have one of these kind of huge new outrage cascades, and the entire internet it becomes like blindly angry about something. And this is by design. Like that's just sort of like that's exactly the same dynamic that it seeks to produce in the commercial realm. It's just happening in a kind of societal realm as a byproduct. But
so then, in this age of attentional digital design and information overload, what would you say then, James, are the most important human qualities, and how do we cultivate those?
Well, I mean, I guess one way of answering your question, and I hope it's not sort of a way of avoiding the question, but so I think there's okay, here's one way to think about this. I think there are like kind of questions about the substance and of like what are those qualities, and there are questions about the procedures. So there are things that like I could, one way of answering this would be to say these are the most important values. These are the things that should be the guiding lights for our life, the kind of goals that we ought to be pursuing, the way we ought to be interacting with each other. But people are very different, and one of the great things about I think people is their diversity, and so I would never presume to say, and I think this is one of the things that I think I would emphasize about the kind of the time well spent, kind of as a meme or community or movement, is it's not seeking to say this is what you ought to consider time well spent. It's more about saying this is the way in which we want to help you spend, like technology ought to help you spend your time, whatever you think time well spent is. And so I think I wouldn't sort of, impose the kind of a substance of the values or the goals on people and say this is what they ought to be moving toward, because that's for people to decide in their own way. But I think that, so not the what, but the how. And I think in terms of the how, the procedures, the processes we use to get there, I think, I guess, at the end of the day, I think that probably one of the essential capabilities or processes to help us figure out what those qualities are is attention, because, I think that's very hard to, to have any kind of reasonable politics, for instance, or interpersonal relationship or education. I mean, most of the things that we consider valuable in life, it's really hard to go about doing them in any kind of reasonable way unless we have that sort of prior ability, the prior freedom, I think, to determine what we give attention to. And so in my mind, all of these, this kind of bundle of processes that we've been talking about under this banner of attention, I think I think to me that's kind of the essential quality, the essential capability for the world today. And I think it's why it's so heartening to see programs like your podcast kind of continually calling attention to attention. Yeah, so I think attention is, I would say, probably the essential quality, because it helps us figure out and move toward and design our life toward whatever the essential kind of substantive qualities that we take to be important are.
Wow, we've gone through loads, James. Have I missed anything? Was there anything burning that you wanted to say to the audience?
I guess it would be interesting to get, because I've listened to a few of previous podcasts of yours, and it seems like, there's, I would just be interested, I guess, to get your thoughts on where you think the, kind of coming at this from an angle of kind of mindfulness and, these various processes that like kind of digital detoxes and these things where a lot of the kind of responsibility for dealing with this stuff, I think, is put on users more so than companies. But I guess I would just be interested to kind of get your perspective on from kind of that direction. Where do you think a lot of this needs to go? Having talked to so many people and thought leaders in this space, what do you see as the big needs that nobody is talking about? Like, what do you think are the big opportunities at the moment?
Wow, thanks. I wasn't expecting that. I think having done this for 3 years, for me, the main challenges that I see, the number one challenge, I think, is having a serious discussion and serious dialogue just between different groups of people and companies with different skill sets that come from different disciplines, to just bring all of our minds together so that we can actually talk seriously and constructively about this. So I'm talking about bringing together designers, policymakers, engineers, marketers, etc. So I think the number one problem at the minute is our silos. I think that's a big thing. The number two is, I think that there's no lexicon, there's no real language of the real problem of this. So there are no real terms that we can use to describe what the problems are and the different solutions we have to them. So if there's no language and no lexicon, then it's hard to put your finger on what the exact problem is, and so it all sounds quite vague and quite fluffy when actually there are real serious problems and serious consequences to those problems. So I think that once we actually do get the right people in the same room together, and we do have the language to be able to discuss this better so that we can create solutions, I think we really need to learn how to connect better, not just running away and not just disconnecting completely. But I don't know, what do you think of that? What do you think of that whole idea of disconnecting completely?
I mean, I guess just on the digital detox stuff, I think it certainly, like, whatever helps people deal with these challenges of attention, of information overload, I think are great, and people should certainly do them and continue to do them. But I've always found the digital detox, like, found that as a metaphor for this issue to be kind of an interesting one, because, as I understand the point of chemical detoxes, the point is to, get all of the stuff out of your system and then kind of go forth back into the world and, change your ways. Not to sort of, it seems like the way that it's used, though, in technology context, is just sort of a periodic retreat from the kind of just the day-to-day, slam of distraction, of information. And so, it seems to me kind of like, it seems to me like it's good to kind of reconnect with sort of the deep human thing. It's better than not connecting with it at all. But it seems to me like the point shouldn't be to just kind of, be walking through the desert, not drinking any water, and then right when you're about to die, drink some water so that you can keep walking through the desert, not drinking any water. It seems to me that the point should be to kind of, I think there's a question of sustainability, I guess is what I'm saying there. And it seems like there's in some of the digital, the way that digital detoxes are used, often there's a kind of resignation that there is no sustainable alternative. And part of this, like, going back to, I think, just is this sense of inevitability and of disempowerment when it comes to kind of the design of technologies. But I guess it seems to me like, I think there's a real opportunity to, I think, to continue to make this point that we can engage with technology, we can sort of have a conversation. It's hard to do, and it's still kind of emerging when it comes to questions of attention, but it seems to me like, I don't know, one of the things when I talk to people, I think there's just the sense I get that they feel all the responsibility for kind of picking up the slack of the way in which technology is pushing all these new responsibilities on them to sort of self-regulate their own behavior. Like, I think there's an opportunity to really give people the sense of permission to push back against the idea that it's all just up to them to deal with this stuff. I think, one of the things I've seen is like every article I read on, almost every article I read on this topic of distraction, it seems like it ends with some kind of like, shrug of the shoulders, like, well, I guess it's just up to users to like figure out how to deal with the zany new world. And I think that's really unfortunate, because I think there are a lot of other directions it could go. And I think part of that involves kind of starting to see this more as a political question, actually.
Yeah, I think for me, I found that whole narrative, it's the user's problem. The user is responsible for their own digital experience. And so if people have a negative experience online, or if people find themselves overly compelled to use a particular service or a particular device, then it's their problem. And actually what they should do is to set up systems or regimes where they don't use that particular thing as much. And I think actually it is unfair when people don't generally understand the effect that these devices and these services have on them, and are designed to have on them.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate, and it misses the point when people say, because they're essentially saying, thousands of the world's most brilliant designers and psychologists and developers are aimed at undermining your willpower. So therefore, you just need to have more willpower. Like, that's essentially the argument. But it's certainly political, and I think it's also important to talk about, because we were talking about some of the global footprint of all this issue earlier. I think there's a very important social justice element here, because if you think about it, there's a lot of especially low middle income countries where they don't have the benefit of having had decades of advertising messages aimed at them, of all these sort of informational rewards in front of them. Like, they don't have the benefit of decades of kind of figuring out how to deal with that stuff. And then now all of a sudden we have this incredibly advanced version of it kind of coming into their worlds. And I've done some kind of work, with nonprofit work with some orphanages in one Eastern European country in particular. And, it was interesting because some students would then kind of start to get a hold of the technology and use it and do amazing things. There was one girl who taught herself computer programming that we worked with. But then others would, use it and kind of fall down some of these rabbit holes of distraction, because there's no people around to help sort of think through. So I think educators have a very important role to play in this, like questions of media literacy and, parents, of course. But anyway, so I think there's a really big social justice component to this too. And I think, as we were talking about, like, how do we kind of help people understand the real depth of the, like, what's at risk, what's at stake with this. I think that angle is something that I haven't thought enough about, and I'd like to think about more. But I think it's certainly a very important piece of all this.
And I think you're right, and I'm just not convinced that something like this can be achieved from a top-down perspective. I just don't think that legislation will be passed and will be able to connect better, as it were, as we're speaking about. And I think our ability to intentionally create the digital world in the way that we want it to be is really important, and kind of creating days like a day of digital peace, things like this where we actively create the web as a space for peace. I think days like these, dedicated days like these, are really important.
Yeah, sure. I think that's certainly like finding ways to kind of symbolize and recognize the need for this is important. I mean, I would almost think of it on the level of weekends rather than holidays, because the original idea of, like, the Sabbath of weekend, it was, instead of working all the time and being in it every day and just exhausted every day, take a day to rest, to have leisure. And to me, it's almost something, because I think it's kind of the difference between periodic kind of symbolism of the thing versus really kind of integrating it into sort of our habits. And I think the more we can redesign our habits, our environment, I think the more likely it is that we'll be able to kind of navigate out of this successfully. And I think one of the things, I think not to kind of take it too broad here, but I think one of the things in the background that is amplifying a lot of the effects of distraction, as we've been talking about it, is the fact that it's happening at a time when we've sort of transitioned to a kind of secular, or broadly like kind of secular world, and that's brought us many great benefits, and I think been a great boon for humanity. But I think there's a set of things that existed in a kind of religious context and it was the habits and practices that we had really iterated over millennia to sort of reliably guide our lives toward a certain set of values. And it's not to say that some particular religious set of values are the right ones, or that it's more just saying that there was a link between the values, some values that were defined, and the practices and habits in our lives. And I think, when we kind of in the move to the secular kind of world, like I think in addition to kind of a lot of the philosophical pieces of religion, we threw a lot of these kind of habits and practices out. And I think what that's left us with is a situation where we kind of have to redesign those from scratch ourselves. And I think that's an enormous thing to put on any person. And so there's actually a German philosopher named Peter Sloterdijk who argues that we ought to kind of reclaim that piece of religion, kind of in the sense of reclaiming that link between the habits and practices of our lives with the values that we kind of want to pursue in our lives. He has a great word for it. He calls it anthropotechnics, is what he uses to talk about it. So I think that is a piece of all this, and I think it's why you see a kind of quasi religious tone to a lot of this stuff around attention distraction, and of course that there's a long tradition of that going back to Huxley, of course, and even further back. But in Simone Weil, who kind of talked about these questions of attention. So I think that and I think it's in a lot of ways the sort of discomfort that a lot of people have of talking about kind of Western religious, that Western religious tradition, because it's so near to us in our past, that you see a lot of people being more comfortable talking about this stuff from a kind of Eastern religious perspective because it's a new language. There's not a sense that there's a kind of as much, baggage, so to speak, about a lot of this. And I think there are certainly benefits of doing so, because there are certain things that those traditions emphasize that the Western traditions don't. At the same time, I think that that has made it a little bit harder and created a little bit more work for those of us who want to, advocate for political solutions or regulatory solutions to some of these issues, because the policy and legal foundations rest on more Western philosophical traditions. So I think that there are pros and cons to that. But I guess all this is to say, I think that in a sense, what we're trying to engineer is something that existed for most of human history in some form, that link between the practices and habits that we have with the values that we have. And I think the challenge now is that, in multicultural kind of pluralistic societies, different people will have different values, and that makes it a lot harder to then kind of come up with one sort of system or one technology or one set of habits, practices that works for everybody, given the diversity of those values. It's not that there is no value that technology is designing for now. I think the first step is to just bring forward into the foreground the values that are already there. And most of the time, it's the value of efficiency. And this is mostly because, this is kind of an implicit value in the practice of software engineering. And it kind of just gets carried forward to be the dominant value of design in the technologies, but it's not really talked about as such explicitly. So then, all of our technologies are seen as a solution to an optimization problem of human life. And the computer is now the dominant metaphor for humans. And there are benefits to that, but there's also a lot of things that makes a lot very hard to do.
One of the things that has been a recurring theme during digital mindfulness is this idea that people have a profound love-hate relationship with email. And given what you've just said, would that explain then this love-hate relationship that people have?
Yeah, I mean, I think email is one of these things where it's something everybody uses pretty much. It's one of the most common experiences of technology any of us have, and it's also a place where it was sort of the first ground zero for the challenge of information overload, even before mobile devices came around. And I think it's interesting to think too then about, like I'm really interested in kind of the concept of spam and how we decided what was spam and what wasn't. Because, there is a sense in which like spam is doing what advertising has always done. And at a certain point, there was a certain line that was crossed and people pushed back and said, this not only is this annoying, this is unsustainable. And it makes it, it threatens the stability of this whole thing called email. And I think similarly, these other areas where this has happened are in like telemarketing and like do not call registries. Like in the UK, I think there's one here, and in the US. But people said like this is a sort of kind of incursion into my private space, and it's of us it done in a way that crosses some kind of maybe potentially moral line. And I think there are a number of things involved there. I think part of it is probably the perceived value of that information coming into the world. Another thing, like you were talking about, we think of the internet as a space. I think there's a sense in which you think of your inbox as a private space, whereas we think of when you go to a web page, you don't think of that as a private space. But from an informational point of view, it's still just it's just code that's putting some information on your screen, and web pages are just as personalized as email a lot of the time, in terms of the ads, in terms of the content itself. So I think that we kind of have these. One of the at a broad level, the internet is kind of broken down these boundaries, and one of the biggest types of boundaries, one of the most fundamental types of boundaries is the boundary between public and private. And I think that it's interesting to look at in digital context where we reimpose this public-private boundary. And I think the inbox is something that everybody kind of agrees this is a private space, so to speak. And so I think that's one reason that it really is something that everybody feels like they can make more of these clear, assertive determinations about in terms of what's appropriate and what's not. Whereas maybe they don't feel like on Facebook or web pages or whatever that they really have the clarity of the boundary setting to do that.
So one of the things that you worked on in the early days, like with Google, was Google Analytics and setting all of that up. And I'm wondering, do you see parallels with the discussion you're having now with time well spent with the discussions you were having back then with online advertising? Like, were people incredulous as to how this was actually going to work and make money, and then it ended up becoming this enormous phenomenon? Do you see parallels with that and time well spent?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's really interesting to kind of see that process and then to see the cycle happen with different technologies. Like there was kind of, even with with online advertising, I had colleagues at Google who would go talk to companies and say, well, there's no image, it's just a text ad, and you don't pay, you pay for it, you bid on it. And some of them, there were people who got laughed out of the room by CEOs, and like why the hell would we bid on an ad? So similar with the social media, where and there are things that are fads, but there are things also that stick. And I think in my mind, the mobile transition and like kind of the smartphone transition was a big pivot point, because I think the first iPhone, I think, came out in 2007. So I think it was maybe that couple year period after 2008, 2009. People are always asking, is this going to be the year of mobile? Is this going to be the year of mobile? And it turns out it's like it wasn't just a year of mobile. It's like it's just interesting to see see people go through that process of skepticism, sort of then, well, like, okay, like it's a thing, but it's then, it's a minimal thing. So then they minimize, and then it's like, well, it's a minimal thing, and maybe it's more important than we thought, but it's not going to fundamentally change things. And then they'll come to realization, okay, yeah, this is like the new normal. And I think it's been useful to see that happen for things like mobile phones, social media, digital advertising, because it sort of, like we were saying, a lot of people don't think that this issue is important. It makes me kind of see where in that sort of trajectory, the life cycle of kind of adoption of concepts or paradigms that we are right now. And I think we're sort of maybe between, we're kind of in a skepticism we're a little, I think probably past skepticism, but I think in the minimization phase of it, where people are saying this is, this is important, but it's not that big of a deal. As long as I use ad blocker, as long as I do digital detoxes, as long as I, just lock myself out of websites for 45 minutes a day, then everything's okay. And so I think that the next phase will be when they realize that it's not that minimal thing, that it's actually like a structural, systemic problem with the design of media as a whole. And so I'm still struggling with how to actually kind of, make that point in a very concise way, as evidenced by the fact I've just taken 2 hours of your time.
But perhaps this change might well come once the tipping point has been reached, once governments or companies realize that actually there's a better way to connect, there's a way to connect digitally, or there's a way to build these services that makes more money, that is more humane, that is more respectful of people's attention.
I think this is a particularly quite hard issue because, it relates to decision making and kind of freedom of choice. Part of it, I think more so than the environmental movement or any other thing like this, we have to kind of change our view of like human nature almost to kind of update it. Because a lot of people still have this thing of like, especially people who are just like in the tech industry, actually, it's like, well, if people don't want to use this, they just don't have to use that technology, or they can just, they can just uninstall it or whatever. And it's this kind of reverting back to thinking of people as just these purely rational beings, while at the same time in their designs taking advantage of the non-rational parts of their brains. So, and then I think we moralize it is the other thing. Like people say, well, I have my technology use under control, but my friend, he's totally distracted. Like we don't want to see it ourselves because we see it as like a moral failing of some sort. So I think there are a lot of headwinds to really getting this right, which is why I think that like the language and the rhetoric we use is so important. And I think it's important to really, the way I'm leaning in toward, talking about all this stuff is talking about it in terms of, especially in like a US context, is talking about it as a type of freedom, for one. But then talking about it as freedom of attention is kind of a phrase that I'm sort of settling on in a way. Anyway, so I think the more we can kind of just link it back to those things people already believe and like minimize the cost of kind of frame switching for them, or minimize the cost of agreeing with sort of our view on this, the better.
Yeah, this is interesting. And just to finish off, I think governments now and politicians, they're becoming increasingly concerned about the digital design for attention rather than intention, particularly when you're doing something complex that requires deliberation, like political engagement, or you're voting in an election, because then, when people live in different informational universes, when truth exists and people simply don't care, or they don't have the attention span to engage with that, but they're rather engaged with clickbait, which might not be true, then that is a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wrote a piece about this. I titled it "The Clickbait Candidate." I can send it to you, but I think that like Trump is very straightforwardly sort of an embodiment of the dynamics of like the attention economy. Like I think he is like, we basically elected a piece of clickbait as president. And it's like, because if you think about the other thing is like with politicians and political points, like like it all has to like compete on the same playing field now against every cat video, every like, random thing that your friends are sending to you, everything your friends ate for dinner. Like it's all has to compete on the same playing field. And like whichever one is best at sort of impulsively pushing our buttons is going to win. And a lot of the time that's not going to be the very sober analysis of economic forecasts, or the nuanced data about climate change. It's going to be impulsive, outrageous things. And that's so to me, like, that's why it's like, the problem with Trump is not Trump. The problem is with the media filtering system that incentivized, that's selected for that piece of information, and keeps giving attention to it in a certain way. Like, and that's why it's so easy to be outraged and amused by Trump, but that's precisely the dynamic that is giving him his power. And I think it's a weird time. It's a weird time to be alive.
So James, if all of the designers and the engineers, if we were all able to design for time well spent, if we were all able to design for intention rather than attention, what do you think some of the benefits society-wide are?
I think even a very small change in this could like change the world, right? I mean, like if you could, there's somebody that says, like, there's somebody that was talking about something like if you could increase the intelligence of people by like 1% or something, like just the enormous change that would have. Like, I think if you could increase the attentional capabilities of people and help make their lives even go like 1% better, that would be like on an aggregate level, the amount of difference that would make would be staggering. It'd be enormous. So I think that's the great thing about this kind of, digital world, is that like even very small changes can propagate and totally transform things. So absolutely. I mean, I think that there's so much possibility. And I think another thing too, and I didn't talk about this much in the interview part, but I think this is a big part of what I'm thinking about lately, is because I think one thing I wonder about sometimes is when it comes to like the web and our current kind of modes of interaction. So like, like the devices, the OSs, browsers, like is stuff already too baked in to really be able to kind of turn the battleship around? And like, I don't know if I have a conclusion on this yet, but I guess it's like, does it make sense to really give most of the attention to sort of, the emerging things like, virtual reality, or, people talk the Internet of Things or artificial intelligence? Because I think especially with AI, because a lot of this stuff is happening at the level of our perception now. Like, you can see the designs of the windows, like visually, and, but when it comes to AI, like all of this stuff is going to be happening behind the scenes, all of the design logic. And it's going to be a lot harder to kind of even know that it's there, much less sort of question it and call attention to it then. So I think there's a role for both, and I don't think it's either or.
Now, James, we've come to the end of the interview, unfortunately, because I could carry this on all night. But where could people find out more about you and your work and connect with you?
Sure. So if you just search for the Oxford Internet Institute, and I have a page on that website, as well as the Time Well Spent movement. If you go to timewellspent.io, you can learn more about that there. And then if any of your listeners are interested in this area and want to discuss it, I'm happy to kind of talk with anybody who would like to kind of have a conversation about some aspect of this space, which is very important.
Well, James, thank you again for spending so much time with us and sharing so much of your wisdom and your insights with us. I really, really appreciate it.
No, thanks for inviting me, Lawrence. It's an honor, and thanks for everything you're doing to bring attention to attention.